The suburbs of Chicago in 1970s were meant to be a sanctuary for families, quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and a sense of security. But hidden among them was a monster masquerading as a model citizen. John Wayne Gacy, a successful businessman and a community leader, wasn't just a man who hosted block parties and dressed as a clown for children's birthday parties. Beneath the facade, he was a calculating predator, responsible for some of the most horrifying crimes in modern American history. This is the story of John Wayne Gacy, the man who preyed on innocence while hiding behind a painted smile. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, to a working-class family. His father was a violent alcoholic who regularly beat him, leaving Gacy desperate for approval and affection. As a young boy, Gacy tried to meet his father's high expectations, but was met with a constant disappointment. This deep-rooted need for acceptance would later manifest in a much darker way. By the 1960s, Gacy had settled into a seemingly normal life. He married, had children, and worked various jobs, eventually starting his own construction company. However, even during these years, disturbing patterns began to emerge. Gacy's marriage fell apart after his first arrest in 1968 for the assault of a teenage boy. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison but was released after serving only 18 months due to good behavior. Upon his release, Gacy returned to Chicago, determined to rebuild his life. He re-established himself as a businessman and became an active figure in local politics. Gacy's ability to charm those around him worked in his favor. No one would have suspected the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. In the 1970s, Gacy became known as Pogo the Clown, performing at children's parties and community events. It was the perfect cover. While he entertained children and volunteered in his community, Gacy's true nature was far more sinister. Gacy's victims were typically young men, many of them runaways, hitchhikers, or boys looking for work. He often lured them into his home under the pretense of offering them construction jobs or other forms of help. Once inside his house, the nightmare began. Gacy would overpower his victims, leaving them trapped, terrified, and at his mercy. He had perfected his method of manipulation. Gacy would use his role as a businessman or his friendly clown persona to disarm these young men. His home, located at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, seemed like a sanctuary, but it was nothing more than a tomb. Gacy's crimes followed a chilling pattern. After gaining the trust of his victims, he would strike, trapping them in his home. His crawl space beneath the house became a burial ground, where he hid many of the bodies. The foul stench that lingered in the neighborhood was dismissed as sewage issues, but the truth was far worse. By the late 1970s, Gacy had murdered at least 33 young men, their lives snuffed out by the man who seemed so ordinary, yet was driven by dark desires. His ability to keep up appearances was remarkable. He hosted parties, dined with politicians, and was known as a man with influence. Meanwhile, beneath his house, the bodies of his victims rotted in cold, dark crawl space. Gacy's crimes could have continued unnoticed if not for the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Pease in December 1978. Robert had gone to meet Gacy about a job opportunity and was never seen again. His family, desperate for answers, alerted the police. For the first time, Gacy's charade was in jeopardy. Investigators quickly learned that Gacy had a history of criminal behaviors. They obtained a search warrant for his home, but it wasn't the first search that uncovered the horror. Initially, they found only small items that raised suspicion, such as high school class ring belonging to one of the missing boys, but soon after, the stench of decay led them to dig deeper. both literally and figuratively. On December 21st, 1978, police made a horrifying discovery. Beneath Gacy's home, they uncovered human remains, piles of bones buried in crawl space. Gacy's reign of terror had finally come to an end. When Gacy was arrested, the world learned the full scope of his depravity. He confessed to the murders, describing them in chilling detail, as if recounting everyday events. His lack of remorse was as shocking as the crimes themselves. Over the years, Gacy had meticulously buried the bodies of 29 boys and young men beneath his house, while 4 more victims were discarded elsewhere. His suburban home had become a mass grave. In 1980, Gacy stood trial for his crimes. His defense attempted to argue insanity, pointing to his violent childhood and mental instability, but the prosecution painted a far different picture, one of manipulative, cold-blooded killer who preyed on the vulnerable. Gacy's crimes were not impulsive or chaotic, they were calculated and deliberate. The jury took only 2 hours to deliberate before finding Gacy guilty of 33 murders. He was sentenced to death, becoming one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Over the next 14 years, Gacy remained on death row. During this time, he continued to maintain his innocence. In interviews, even blaming others for his crimes, he painted portraits of clowns while awaiting his execution, a macabre reflection of the duality that had defined his life. On May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at a Stateville Correctional Center. His final words reportedly expressed no regret. He died as he had lived, defiant and unrepentant. For the families of the victims, Gacy's execution brought a sense of closure, but the scars he had left behind would never fully heal. John Wayne Gacy's story serves as a grim reminder that the evil can hide in plain sight. He was a man who embodied the role of a trusted neighbor, a community figure, and a children's entertainer. Yet, behind the clown's makeup and the smiling facade, he was a predator who preyed on the innocent. His ability to mask his true nature allowed him to commit unspeakable acts of violence for years without suspicion. The killer clown is long gone, but the terror he unleashed on the suburbs of Chicago will never be forgotten. His crimes left a mark not only on the families of his victims, but on the entire nation. It's a haunting tale of how appearance can deceive, and how, in the most unlikely places, monsters can walk among us.